Welcome back, everyone. Coach Robert here. So before we get into our live stream lesson about the isolated queen pawn structure today, I wanted to mention that I have a merch store now. So let me see if I have the link here. I decided to use Stream Elements because why not? And I just put a bunch of items in the shop last night, and I ordered a few for myself to share with you guys, including like mugs and t-shirts and a hoodie. For now, I've got a few things in mind after that, but I want to see how to make different items that are not all the same pattern. I decided to go with my stream logo, which you guys know is the horsey. So there's the link. It's in the YouTube chat. It's also on my YouTube channel. So if you guys are watching the replay or something and you don't want to click on the link in the chat, you can always find it later on the links section of my YouTube profile. So I look forward to showing you what the t-shirts look like and maybe what the mug looks like, that kind of thing. But you can check it out for yourself in the store and maybe order something if it entices you. So shifting gears now. So this is our pawn structure of the day, and it's called the Isolani, which is kind of funny, as Soltis pointed out in his book about pawn structures, because when you write a word like Isolani ending in an I like that, it's sort of saying that you want to treat it as if it were a Latin root word, but since it's Isolani, it's like just one isolated pawn, so it makes you wonder why it's not called Isolanus, but that's spelled in a really funny way, so that's probably why they avoided it. Another possible reason, while we're on the topic, could be that we're talking about all the different isolated pawn situations. So collectively we call them Isolani positions or something. But anyway, that's all just neither here nor there. It's just how the terminology is. But isolated queen pawn is more specific and probably more relevant, because if you imagine how the pawn structures arise, you have to think about which pawns have already left the board and how that could have occurred, among other things. And when we're considering the isolated queen pawn, it's pretty evident that the C and D pawns were exchanged for the black C and D pawns were exchanged for the white C and E pawns, and those exchanges probably occurred on or around C4 and D5. or on D4, so somewhere on those squares, right? So you could imagine an opening with moves like D4 and C4 for white, and D5 and C5 for black, something like that. And at some point, white plays E3 to support their D pawn, then a trade happens there. So it might have been like this. Black played these moves, and so this is actually the E pawn who goes onto the D file, but we'll always call it the D pawn because that's where it is right now, irrespective of its history. Yeah, so some trades happened in the center, and these trades, you could easily imagine someone pushing these, they call them queen bishop pawns in the old books, without really getting into any trouble. If you try to imagine a position like this, but on the king side, the way that it would occur would have to be with a similar kind of exchange of pawns. So for there to be pawns on the C file, and instead of an isolated D pawn, like this guy's on E4, this guy's missing, the way that this kind of thing would happen, and probably with this pawn on D6, not here. So we're nixing this one and this one. In order to have the equivalent pawn structure on the king side, you would need to have played moves with your king bishop pawn, and if you're castling king side, you could imagine how that might be tactically or strategically dangerous because of your king safety. So that's why that pawn structure occurs much less frequently, because it's not as safe to push the king bishop pawn most of the time in the opening as the queen bishop pawn. You can often play c4 without jeopardizing your king whatsoever. So that's how we often get into this, and this can happen in many openings. It's an extremely topical pawn structure. It happens a lot. So whatever opening you play, you have to know at least at some point in some variation, how to play an isolated queen pawn. So let's get into it, I guess. I don't think I missed any notes here. So this is just the structure itself. Oh yeah, so the strategy behind it, right? So there's sort of a push and pull. If you are on the side that has the better structure from a classical standpoint, the well-connected pawns, right? These guys are all close together. They should be able to protect each other in a pinch, and they should be easily defensible by the pieces. If you have the better structure, then your strategy is going to involve mostly putting a piece right in front of this isolated pawn and blockading it. That's the classical strategy. You want to prevent this pawn from ever advancing, because if this pawn can ever safely advance, for instance, imagine if we play the move e5 and then white responds with d5. The pawn in the center of the board would be exerting an influence on some pretty important squares. c6 and e6 are common places to try to place your minor pieces, for example. Or if you want to double your rooks on maybe the open file like the c file, you could easily imagine how the d5 advance could be inconvenient. So you want to restrain the pawn from advancing, and since there are no pawns that can defend it long term, you want to try to win this pawn. And from the other side, the side with the worse structure, you have this weak pawn potentially, but what you get as compensation is control of these advanced support points. And if you can play d5, you would get control of these squares too. So these squares are sort of, like, in a soft way, also under threat. So you get control of these squares with the pawn. In addition, you get to fight for this open file and pressure the e6 pawn. This is a half open file. So you get to place your heavy pieces in such a way that they pressure these files. Just as a result of how the pawn structure is made, white is often going to go for some dynamic attacking options, and black is going to try to go into the endgame. And this all just comes from the fact that this pawn is weak long term, but controls some key squares. So just the pawn structure itself tells us how to play this position. Let's see an example of how the pawn can advance in a very effective way for the side who has the isolated queen pawn. This game is Ostojic versus Vaganian. Again, I'm using examples from Soltis' book. Like I mentioned earlier, you can get this pawn structure from a variety of openings. In this case, we're getting an isolated queen pawn from the French defense, and this is a Tarrasch variation when you play knight d2. This is one of the French lines that causes IQP. That's the short version, IQP, very often. You often get the isolated queen pawn also in the Queen's Gambit and in the English opening. So anyway, as I mentioned in the diagram position back here, when you are expecting to see an isolated queen pawn for either side, you are expecting to see this kind of pawn tension. So whenever you see all these pawns having a party in the center of the board, there's some way that it can shake out to create an isolated queen pawn. And we are not quite in that situation yet for a few different reasons. But I do want to walk you through how we could think about making the pawn structure, because I think for some people, creating the pawn structure, it's more like pawn structures just happen to them. They're not really like pawn structure savvy and aiming for a structure intentionally. So just walking through that process, once you see this pawn tension, you might want to follow the old Russian adage that whenever you have a bunch of pawns facing each other, you should take one of them. But if we examine what happens if we, for example, take this one, let's put a note to myself here that this is what we're looking at today. So if we take this way, we could definitely get an isolated queen pawn if black takes with a pawn. because next we can take this one, and hey look, this one's isolated. There's no c pawn and no e pawn anymore. We've by force in the last 2 moves eliminated both of those pawns. But there are a couple of considerations here. All right, Anna asked an interesting question. He said, "If it's a trash variant, why do you play it?" Well, I don't think it's trash. Maybe you could clarify a little bit for me what you meant by that. So, after d takes c5, bishop takes c5. Even though this is an isolated queen pawn scenario, this is not a favorable one for white, because you could imagine getting the same position without giving this extra free move to black, just to keep it in a really simple way. So even though you could get it, you don't necessarily want to. Additionally, they could try to avoid it with queen takes d5. So if you really, really, really want your isolated queen pawn, you might need to be more patient and develop your pieces. All right, Anand has an interesting comment. He says, I saw some GM say that if there's pawn tension on the board, then you shouldn't take unless there is some reason. That's accurate, and I definitely agree. The specific phrase that I was thinking of is for situations in which you have tension only on these squares. Oh, Tarash. Okay, not trash. I don't play the Tarash very often. I play it sometimes, but mostly like for educative reasons. I prefer the classical variation because I think it's more of a theoretical test for black. But the Tarash, I think it also gives white a very comfortable position without much effort in most situations. Yeah, so, and also, even though this phrase that, like, if you see tension, like, on d5, d4, c4, and c5, you should take one of the pawns, even though that's a thing, I also just think you should be concrete about these things all the time. It's more of like a blitz or bullet chess idea that, like, let's say you go into a position, I'm just going to play a whole new line to keep this separate. Let's just pretend that, like, we get something like this, and you're playing bullet. Instead of agonizing, perhaps, over whether you should support, or, like, with the pawn or with the knight or something, you just take on d5, like, automatic, because this creates chances for you to eventually, like, I don't know, for example, take on c5 and then take on d5. It's a very, like, fast chess, quick maths, it's a caveman kind of rule. It's not something that I would recommend if you're playing classical chess. You should definitely think through any exchanges that you make, especially these forever pawn moves. So anyway, this is the Tarash. Welcome in a circle of the ancient puns. So this is our Tarash thing, and again, the game's Ostojic versus Vaganian, and after knight c6, let me see. Since we were talking about the theory a little bit, I think knight c6 is not the main move in this position. I think these days people, they take on d4, and we'll see, like, pawn takes d5, queen takes d5, and then knight b3 or something like that. I think bishop c4 first with the tempo. And then here, black has a bunch of places to put the queen. Only queen moves make sense. I think queen d6 is interesting, and then at some point they're going to play knight b3. Maybe castle first to avoid queen b4. Like, this might be a continuation. And now knight c6. And I think part of why this is the main line is because with all these simplifications, black can tolerate their lack of space a little bit better. And they don't get an isolated queen pawn, like what we're talking about in the game. So knight c6 is already an interesting moment here for our discussion of the pawn structure. Queen d6, knight e4. Okay, hold on. Let me see about that. I don't think knight e4 is effective here, because doesn't this forces you to play knight d2 again. So that's why I thought castling instead. I also want to recover this d pawn. I think that's important. Anywho, so knight c6 is what was played by Vaganian, and Now after pawn takes, once you reach this situation, there are basically only two pawn structure situations that are going to arise. You are going to see black playing c4 to avoid the isolated queen pawn, but this also is something of a concession. Or they're going to take on d4. Or if they refuse to do either of those things, white can say, be our guest, and take on c5. So basically, isolated queen pawn is very, very likely in this situation. Not the least because if you play c4, it's not a very active choice. If white wants to break the structure, they can with b3 and just take on c4, or force you to capture. Or they can just work around it because the queen side is not really going anywhere after you play c4. Black would have more space there, but in my experience, it's not often working out. So once this e takes d5 move has already happened, it's pretty surefire that we're going to see an isolated queen pawn. But that doesn't mean we should take right away, because if you're considering entering the isolated queen pawn, we want it in the best possible way, since in modern times people understand that the isolated queen pawn gives some dynamic chances for white. In the past, people viewed the isolated queen pawn as just merely like a weakness, and that all the technique in these positions was for the side who doesn't have an isolated pawn to like corral that pawn, never let it move, and then just go to the end game and win it. But it turns out that that is not so simple, and we'll actually see an example of that today. But even when I learned how to play chess, people had these misconceptions because chess theory is evolving somewhat rapidly, even for relatively basic things like the isolated queen pawn. So here, Ostojic chose bishop b5, which is trying to put pressure on the center and finish development, so that's pretty good. Vaganian chose bishop d6, and now this is our cue to take on c5. If that's what we want, we should play it. In a circle has a good point that if in the other variation where I was suggesting b3, they could play c3, but I meant with preparation. b3 is just the idea. Like you could play c3 first to fix the c pawn, then play b3 to begin dismantling the pawn chain. And you could even do it later in the game. You don't have to do it immediately. Although I do think immediately probably is better. Anyway, so now that the bishop is moved, we can take on c5. This is a very, very common strategic motif in the opening. You'll often see, just for comparison, you'll often see in the Queen's Gambit, I think, let's look at e6 for the real Queen's Gambit decline stuff. I'm trying to look at a common move order, so maybe we'll play e3. It needs to be a common move order that illustrates my point. Bishop e7, okay, let's just pretend. And the reason I'm showing you this is that we have a similar kind of pawn tension, but like rotated, color flipped, because in the position we were just looking at, white waited for black to move this bishop, and then they took on c5. Here, black has an option to take on c4, but they want to wait for white to move this bishop. So you'll often see in this position, white plays bishop d3 because they want a castle. They're basically saying that, I don't want to play queen c2, I don't want to play b3, those are interesting moves, but I really want to develop my king and get my rook in the game. But only after you see this bishop move, people usually are taking here and then playing c5. So this is a typical way of playing the Queen's Gambit, and you might be more familiar with it. So I just want to point this out because it's the same as what's going on here in this position. Black moved the bishop, and now they're taking on c5 with a tempo. So often, at least in a very beginner kind of way, if you are trying to get a good isolated queen pawn situation, you are generally going to need that extra tempo. Here, Vaganian did not cooperate. They played an accurate move. I believe it's an accurate move. Soltis also thought it was an accurate move. It was queen e7 check. And the reason I would say this is accurate is that it gives white a hard decision. When they're going for this isolated queen pawn, they might also want to try to catch black's king in the crossfire by castling quickly. I think this is more of a psychological error, though, because, as mentioned before, you often handle the isolated queen pawn by blockading it and going to the endgame. So I think white should not be averse to play queen e2. Usually what we're going to see is something like this. I would take with the king because they don't want to let up the pressure. And then knight b3. And probably bishop e3 to try to get rid of one of the pieces controlling the blockading square. So you might see a position like this, which I think is perfectly fine, but people are probably not happy to enter this line because they want to get some initiative. So in this game, Ostojic probably got confused and played this move, which makes this game actually a good example of our our motif here, that the isolated queen pawn can actually become a powerful force. That's where I wanted to start, because the typical discussion is about how you blockade and win the isolated queen pawn, and we'll see that. But little bit of a warning here: you shouldn't just go into an isolated queen pawn every single time. There are favorable and unfavorable versions, and now this version is unfavorable. It's probably close to equal. Bishop c5 is a forced move, so we don't need to really think too hard about this. I think castling makes the most sense because the problem in white's position is this bishop's pinned. So let's really think about this one. Why is this unfavorable? Well, right now black controls the blockading square more than white does. The blockading square is d4 because it's right in front of the isolated queen pawn. So if white could make equal control of that square and then systematically eliminate the pieces while creating a second weakness, they would be better. But it's not that clear how to accomplish that. Like, let's say black just plays a natural move like knight f6, just finishing the development. Knight b3 is the way that you're going to control the square more with tempo, so I think this position is very reasonable to consider. This is also what happened in the game. Yeah, black does look more active for sure, but finding out that this position is not just equal requires a little bit of introspection, probably, because alright, so here's one of the modern developments in the isolated queen pawn. This is actually even since Soltis wrote his book on the pawn structure chess. If you can trade all the pieces and leave the pawn structure intact, what do you guys think the evaluation is? Pop quiz. And if you're watching the replay, you can pause the video and think about it, because this is a really interesting question. If we get rid of all the pieces and leave the pawn structure just how it is white better or is it equal? We're imagining that black can't possibly be better because they have a weakness and white has no weaknesses, which is pretty logical. Anand's asking if black can castle queenside. I would not castle queenside for black, because if you castle queenside, you can't use the half-open c-file. Your king would be there. I mean, maybe you could, but it would take you a very long time, and your king would never find safety until it reaches a8. Alright, so Anand says white is better in the king and pawn endgame, where we just have a pawn on d5. Any other votes? Even if it's just a guess, you know. Let's say you just want to vote against Anand. Anyone want to have a dissenting opinion? Okay, Inner Circle's giving an engine evaluation. I want an engine evaluation. Like, just conceptually, like white's better, white's slightly better, white's winning. Those kinds of things, I think they're more helpful than like engine assessments, because that's based on like a thought process and how you handle the position, as opposed to like what's the current engine opinion. After all, engine evaluations of positions, they change over time because the engines are changing over time. So I think like white's better, black's better, even though it's more imprecise from a numerical standpoint. It's more I don't want to say repeatable, but something like that. It just seems better to me. Okay, so Anand is imagining the flank pawns being locked and black in a zugzwang. That's a really good concrete idea. We should definitely see about that. Now, the funny thing about this position, if you take everything away, except for the pawns and the kings, is that it's equal. And the reason that it's equal is that black does not have a second weakness. There's this principle of 2 weaknesses that has emerged, where you need at least 2 weaknesses to win. That's part of why the top level Grandmaster games often end in a draw, because the creation of a decisive second weakness is an art in and of itself, and it's quite difficult. And so just because you got this isolated queen pawn, even if it's a favorable isolated queen pawn scenario for the side who wants to blockade and win the d pawn, you still need a second weakness, and creating that requires a lot of maybe both luck and precision. So if you believe in luck, I'm not sure. Okay, so in a circle meant just white's better. Point 8 sounds pretty great. It sounds like you might be winning that king and pawn game eventually. So in the game, here comes bishop g5. Oh, so part of why I got into that. So if you need at least a second weakness to be better as white, here white is like light years away from that, because they've created just one weakness, but they're also behind in development. They can't fully control the blockading square, and black also has their own compensation. So let's get into that. Bishop g5, castling, because castling is safe and good. And here white played queen d2. So we're going to get into where the source of counterplay is for black. First of all, they don't have a second weakness. That's really good. But the next factor to take into account is that they have control of their own squares because of this pawn. Remember how we said that e4 and c4 are really great squares, and they have the open files and things like that? Yeah. So here you might want to suggest a move here for black, and if you're watching the replay, you can pause and then think over what you think is going to happen. How are we going to try to take advantage of the assets in our position, these open files and the activity of our pieces and so on, while avoiding the creation of more weaknesses. Okay, so we have an idea from Anand. It's bishop f5, and the idea is to put the bishop actively, control the outpost square on e4, and bring the rook to c8, which is quite active. I'm wondering if you're running into any concrete issues with bishop f5. I'll put it here just to make a note. Okay, so hey Luis, welcome. The OG streaming partner Luis emerges. I hope you're having a good day, Luis. And we should do a stream together when we can. So the tactical problem with bishop f5, you can pause if you're watching the replay, or if you're in the chat, you can try to suggest it real quick. The issue with this is that while your bishop is actively placed on f5, it's also becoming a tactical target. I don't know, maybe this is not as impossible as I thought. Let me see. Okay, maybe I take it back. Knight d4 in this position, let me see. Knight takes, bishop takes, queen takes. e2's hanging. So bishop takes f6 is what I was thinking. And the issue I thought was queen d5. And the way that you're typically getting counterplay here, excuse me, is with queen b2. But your bishop's hanging. But then I realized after I thought that you can play this move and then take on b2, and black should be fine here, I think. This looks basically fine. Yeah, this should be fine. So actually, I don't know if that's a tactical issue. Maybe this is actually a fine move. So, like putting something on e4 seems like a very reasonable next move. Luis was suggesting knight d4, trading pieces right away, but I think e4 is hanging at the end of the line. Like chop, you should chop back, I imagine. And I chop this one, and if you chop on f6, I'll chop with the bishop and save it. And if you chop here, I'll chop here. There's a lot of chopping going on. It's like a chopping party. So this would lose a piece. And if you play bishop, all right, and if you play bishop takes first, you can't play knight d4 anymore. Black's control is too much. And if you do this, then I can just take this with check. Okay, so I think it's not quite shaken out. So that's an interesting and good idea. But in the game, Vaganian chose queen e6, which Soltis awarded with an exclamation point. He didn't really say why bishop f5 is no good, but I think one of the strengths of the Soltis pawn structure book is that it doesn't go into unnecessary detail in moments of the game that don't pertain to the pawn structure. So if you're trying to learn how to play the pawn structure, you're going to have to fill in these extra details yourself, like why not this, or like what's the tactical problem with that. But it does do a pretty thorough job of controlling the pawn structures that were known like 40 years ago. Especially since it really comes off like a passion project, because he didn't have any engine analysis, and his stuff is quite nice. Yeah, queen e6 does look strange. It's a pretty difficult move to spot, especially when you see bishop f5. That move makes more sense to me. Unless I'm missing a tactic. Hold on, let's just like, is there something here that's just going on? I have a suspicion. All right, let's say we throw this one. All right, maybe not that one, because there could be some shenanigans with like knight e4 check. Okay, so that's a shenanigan. We don't do that. Even if it doesn't work, I don't care. I want to use this rook. Maybe this is why it didn't get honorable mention. Like if you play, for instance, queen d6, I don't think your pieces are coordinating that well. Now knight d4 looks like Tradesville because nobody's hanging. But queen e6, it's rational for a couple of reasons. Luis is suggesting queen f5, which is definitely an interesting option. It controls the outpost square more if you play queen f5, like you can play knight e4. So it's breaking the pin, so it's preparing knight e4. It also is overprotecting d5 in some lines. I think the main thing is just to get the knight on e4, because that's something that's highly desirable in this isolated queen pawn. If you can get knight e4, and you can still coordinate your other pieces to squares like g4. You're pressuring f2 strongly. It comes with tempo, potentially. There's a lot of good things here. And white cannot use that same tactic that we saw before, because there's no hanging bishop on f5, right? I mean, even if there were, we're probably fine as we saw. But this is kind of what's happening. We're trading our weak d pawn for the b pawn, and this is just creating weaknesses in white's territory at no cost. So that's all pretty cool. Yeah, knight g4 could also come up. Rook a e1, queen e6 looks very dangerous. Yeah, this one I'm not sure about. Like maybe this. I don't think knight g4 is working here. Yeah, I'm not sure about that one. So knight e4 happened in the game. Yeah, I would agree, Luis. And after queen c1, now it looks like white is getting kind of rolled, honestly. This is just so dangerous. Now, because black's position is so good, there's like a million ways to be better here, I think. Like, probably even taking on g5 and just nabbing the bishop pair leaves black better off. But of course they can do better. The knight is super good on e4. And if I had a choice between which bishop to take, I would rather get rid of this light square bishop because it creates all the play against h7. So here, maybe we could pause and you guys could suggest a move for black. How should black increase their pressure? Because they do have a great position. We just need to see, like, how do we increase that? And as mentioned, often in the isolated queen pawn, we are playing for a kingside attack. So think for attacky type stuff. Alright, Anna is saying f5. So you say, can black play f5? But what's your idea? If you give me just f5, I'm not really sure what you are trying to accomplish. If you're trying to overprotect e4, I think e4 is already overprotected because if they take on e4, you're taking with the d pawn, and that fixes your structure. Then it becomes like you have a kingside majority, 4-3. They have a queenside majority, 3-2. But your kingside majority is well advanced and supported by active pieces, so you're kind of like in a much better position to have the majority imbalance. Alright, Inner Circle says rook e8 for the development. I think rook e8 could cut both ways, because if white can get queen f4 and then rook a e1, then that rook could be hanging in some variation. So I'm really in a hurry to get this bishop on c8 involved. That's one of the things that you can figure out with like the 3 questions method that Ogard came up with that I always endorse. Like, if you ask yourself which is the worst placed piece, I would say that the bishop on c8 is worst placed, because the bishop it's not well placed in its own right, and it's also blocking the rooks from joining the fray with like rook e8, like what you wanted to play. So I would focus on something that helps get this bishop in. So Anand was suggesting f5 because they want to play f takes e4. I think f5 is a really big ask for something that white may not do. Maybe they don't want to take on e4. And meanwhile, you've committed f5, which has no other purpose than to get like a fantastic position if they take on e4, which is already good for black. If they play bishop takes e4, they give up the bishop pair in an open position, and they repair your pawn structure. So I don't think f5 discouraging bishop e4 is really where it's at. It doesn't help you in other ways, as far as I can tell. Excuse me. The move in the game was queen g6. And this move makes a lot of sense because it gets out of the way of our bishop at a moment when white is not ready to take advantage of the weakness of the d-pawn or anything like that. And it is kind of self-pinning. Excuse me, sorry. But I don't think it's consequential that there's this pin. They can't take advantage of it. In the game, they play bishop f4 to try to avoid probably losing a piece or being forced to take on e4. I'm imagining something like, I don't know, what's a natural move for white here? Maybe like queen f4. That looks pretty natural. We might run into a problem like knight b4. Even though the knight on b4 is hanging, I'm not sure I really care. The idea here is to pressure them into trading on e4 with this bishop. And if they try to decline and play a move like a3, we'll just take the bishop ourselves and then play maybe even knight f2. But anyway, if they end up getting pressured to take on e4, the king side just looks pretty loose. Probably white has options here, and I'm just not familiar with what they are exactly. To me, bishop f4 looks rather passive. I'm not entirely sold on like why they would play bishop f4, and it got no comment in the book. Yeah, looks like Inner Circle got the queen g6 idea. It does help a lot. It's nice. So here comes bishop h3. This is much more ambitious than playing bishop f5. But of course, we only had the option to play bishop h3 because they played bishop f4. Alright, now it's tactics time. What happens if they play bishop g3? Need a short variation here. How's black going to punish white for playing this move? The idea is to cover up g2 and stop the mate. That's why they're playing it, but... it's tactics time. Eater Master, welcome. Knight takes g3 is accurate, except for the queen hanging on g6. So how do you deal with that problem with your variation? Obviously, if they play h takes g3, you play queen takes g3 and you're winning, because there's no way to cover all of black's threats, including queen g2. But if you play knight g3, they'll probably play bishop takes g6. What do you think about that? Yeah, knight e2, good. So here you play knight g3. We don't care. You have to overcome this resistance by finding the move knight e2, which saves your hide, because now you can play knight takes c1. And after an improving move like this, I guess, yeah, I would take on c1 because I'm threatening knight b3. So kind of have to do that one. And here I think I would rather take like this. Or even h takes. I don't really know. Maybe h takes, so that long term we can pressure the h pawn. Either way, it's kind of good. So knight e1 was their choice. Maybe they should have tried to maybe they should have tried that worse endgame, because knight e1 looks terribly passive. I have not shown this game before, Anand. I don't think I have, anyway. I don't think so, because some things in this, like, they feel kind of new to me as I'm looking at them. Alright, Unimaster says this is Botez Gambit. I don't want to give anything their name. So the game continued with rook e8, which was like Inner Circle's idea, but getting the bishop out to a very active square before you play rook e8 makes sense. It's kind of like, it's like in the other video I made where it's like knights, then bishops, then rooks most of the time. I think this is a good example of that. It's the most natural way to play. Okay, so now the bishop's actually hanging. So here it comes back to f5. So we're going to use everyone's ideas in this game. And after bishop e3, we can see one of the other themes that I was mentioning, that whenever this isolated queen pawn is permitted to advance, I'm not quizzing you guys because I think it's a pretty obvious thing, like, no, we don't want to trade, we want to attack. When it's allowed to advance, even though it shuts off control of some squares, the effect that this pawn exerts on c3 and e3 is really, really strong. Like, this bishop now doesn't have a very reasonable function, and additionally the c-pawn is a weakness. It cannot really advance without getting captured. So they played the obvious move. And maybe here's time for a pop quiz. If you were black, what would you play? and you should come with an idea, like a move, but also like some justification for your move. Whenever I'm streaming or putting out a video, I try to use examples that I haven't seen shared before, just because I think rehashing the same stuff that everybody has shown in the same way that it's been shown is kind of not productive. Like if I was going to publish a science paper, I would not do it on something someone else already did. I have a similar feeling about the chess stuff. Although I do show classics and I show things from books, but I think the presentation is at least novel. Any thoughts, you guys? How should black proceed? I think you could make an argument for a few different moves. For instance, you could argue that you want to improve your worst place piece and bring the rook from a8 to like the c file to pressure the c pawn, something like that. All right, Anand wants to sack a piece. It's an interesting idea. I wonder how you will accomplish it, because I think the knight on e1, even though it's very passive, it does a good job of controlling these light squares. Master has a nice idea, and Inner Circle says rook e6 to lift the rook and pressure maybe e1. So I'm guessing you mean rook e6 followed by rook a e8. I think that's also very reasonable. Like maybe you could, assuming the knight's gonna sit still, like put some pressure on g2 and then try rook takes e1. That's a nice idea. But Master found knight b4, which I think is a good preliminary step for these sacrificial and attacking ideas, because this is basically white's only good minor piece, and the knight on c6 is not participating very much. So we're going to trade that knight for the bishop on d3 and get rid of all of white's pressure. The unfortunate side effect of knight b4, which is part of why I think there are probably other moves for black that are strong, is that while it gets rid of this bishop, it also liberates white's development somewhat. So I'll just show maybe the end of the game in a couple interesting moments. They played knight f6, threatening to win a pawn. Queen d2 protecting that. Bishop e4 threatening mate. This is a really good move because it's pressuring g2. They played bishop g3 because they kind of have to. And after knight h5, they're going to lose that bishop as well. I do feel like white got some breathing room, though, in the last couple of moves. Now, the next sequence is kind of insightful. They play queen c6, which forces f3. Now, let's figure it out. Why did they want to force f3? What's their intended response here? So, black to play, and try to understand the reasoning behind f3. Every pawn move leaves weaknesses behind. So when they play f3, it covers up their light squares in a nice way, but it weakens their dark squares. And this highlights one of the strengths of this d pawn, that it controls e3 now. Alright, so Anand says knight takes g3. I think after h takes g3, you've let some tension go there. I don't think you need to commit to knight g3 yet, even if you eventually want to do it. e3 is definitely weak, so the way that we take advantage is by playing bishop takes d3. And now, no matter what white does to recapture, they're going to have to deal with the weakness of e3. which is a consequence of the strong isolated pawn. So they took with the c pawn. I think the reason they took with the c pawn was to try to avoid getting pressured on the open c file. But anyway, everything's kind of not working. So now knight g3. It's just kind of best practice to save this for later. I mean, it's with check and everything, so you don't need to do it immediately. But now that the bishop actually might have a future on f2, it's eliminated. And now rook e3. And the rest of the game is quite short. It centers around the fact that this knight is useless, white's king is weak, and black's pieces are active. So the invasion begins. Pressure on the weakness near the king. And now we get h5. I feel like in this game we're using every idea that you guys mentioned in the chat, just at different times. Now here, they could have taken on g3, but that lets up a lot of the tension. It goes directly to a heavy piece endgame where white might have counterplay. So they first provoke f4 to get access to key squares. And they're winning a pawn anyway. And after bishop g3, they resigned because they can't move the rook without losing the game immediately. Yeah, there's a nice checkmate here. And I think you meant nice checkmate like after rook e3. Something like this, right? Because the queen no longer covers h6. They would probably play queen e2 here, but so I don't think we're gonna see a mate. But yeah, you're kind of right. Like we would get something nice if they don't play queen e2. Like, and here they have to block with the rook, which is miserable. Here I'd probably play something sadistic like rook e8. Anyway, so the way the game ended was with an invasion on the dark squares. And the d pawn is really, really good in this final position, even though it's an isolated pawn. So like 20 years before Soltis wrote this book in the 70s, it was widely believed that the isolated queen pawn is like a pure weakness. But then people started to come up with really good ways of handling this objectively like less solid pawn structure. This was an example of white going astray in the opening by playing passively. In a Tarrasch French. They played passively by playing bishop e2. They should have played queen e2. And accepted that there's no attack. They have to go to the endgame. And so as a result, black first equalized because they don't have a second weakness. Sorry, in this line. So black is equalized. And then by accurately maneuvering to put their knight on its best square on e4, they were able to make white make some difficult decisions and get a good position. So this was a cool game. Now the next game that we'll look at is about the blockaded Isolani. It's when somebody has the isolated pawn, but they don't get that activity that they need, and it becomes a target in the endgame. But I think this game's interesting because in Soltis' notes, he makes no mention of how the endgame that they get at is equal. In fact, there is no second weakness in this example. And I think he just missed in his analysis that there is a way for black to equalize, which is quite typical for analysis in this time. Methods of defense for the kind of endgame that we get, like I mentioned earlier, are now known. So here's an example of a situation where that Russian adage about taking a pawn applies. Whenever you see this square of pawns, you should take one of them, is what the phrase is saying. It doesn't mean anywhere else, and it means only in light blitz, pretty much. So here we see white applying the rule. But of course this is all theory, and these are really strong players. This is Bogoljubow versus Rosenthal. And so they know their theory. It's not just that they're taking a pawn because a Russian proverb told them to. So we're gonna go. You know what? I think we should just go to the blockading moment and then the end game and wrap this one up. Okay. So white wants to be sure that they have a knight on d4. Hello, chess starter. Welcome. So if white wants to make sure that they keep a knight on d4, what move should they play here? Just mention it in the chat if you could. Or if you're watching the replay, of course, you can pause and think about it. The troll in me wants to say queen takes d4 because when knight takes d4, then knight takes d4, and then you have a knight on the outpost square. But of course, we're not handling a position where we should go up the queen to control an outpost square. Of course not. Knight b5. It is fancy and it's accurate. This is what we should do. So this means that they have no way of dealing with their pawn that they're about to lose. And in my notes from the first time that I read this book, I wrote that black could try to play d3, but after queen takes d3, knight b4, just to look for something active. Nothing really special is coming up here. Either way, the knight's coming on d4. It's kind of a silly note. Anyway, so they tried this, and the knight is sitting on d4 just fine. And I would say that something that hasn't been mentioned in the book is that black played h6, and I think this is already something that if I were playing white, I would be happy to see, because with h6 in play, there's kind of a hook in a pawn endgame. I could eventually get together g4 and h4 and break with g5 because h6 has been played. Black cannot say the same thing about me playing b3 or g3 because they're the one with the first weakness, the d pawn. So that was not mentioned by Soltis, but I think that is a factor for going into this endgame. Now here, black is about to castle, and they might just have some active pieces, especially because white's bishop can't really pressure the weakened like h7 square. It's just not deployed properly for active stuff. So what should white do? What do you guys think? I actually think that Bogoljubow missed an opportunity here, or maybe he saw it but just didn't understand that it was best. Chess starter has it right. We should take the bishop on e6. And the reason we should take it is, number one, it gives us the bishop pair. And second of all, it creates a new target for us. Actually, maybe several targets. Like, there are lots of weaknesses in this way. But we'll see that even this weakness is not sufficient. Alright, let's see. Anand says, if blockading is good for white, why didn't black exchange his bishop for it? Let's go back to this moment. I don't see where black could exchange either of their bishops. So if you could clarify, Anand, that would be helpful. Yeah, I didn't see any opportunity. Besides, it's not necessarily the case that you can only blockade with a knight. Blockading with a knight is especially convenient because the knight is a short-range piece, so it's more sensitive to what square you put it on than a bishop is. Like, if you put the bishop anywhere on this diagonal, it controls that diagonal in both directions, right? But if you put the knight here, it's much worse than it is here, which is worse than it is here, and it's really great here. You see, like, it really matters where the knight is because it only has a limited scope. So blockading with the knight is convenient, but it's not like you can only blockade with the knight. You often will blockade with your king in the endgame as well. Right, so he's saying bishop c5 instead of bishop e7. So if you play bishop c5 and try to take this knight, it really doesn't do anything. I also can take on e6. I'm even wondering some things. I might even have knight e6, fe6, and then rook c1, hinting at something. about your rook. But you could castle. Okay, but even if I let you do your plan, I'm going to play probably like queen takes d4 and bring my rook to d1. So trading an extra pair of pieces doesn't help. That's probably why the outpost strategy is such a good long-term approach to the pawn structure. Now here, queen d3 was played. And after castling, they played e4. And Soltis gave this an exclamation point, because this leads to an endgame, which I think he views as like the ultimate realization of the isolated queen pawn issue. White transforms the isolated queen pawn into a situation where there's a weak e pawn and trades off the d pawn in order to get at that weakness. That's kind of what Soltis is saying by giving this move an exclamation point. He says that's really good. But here again, we see kind of a situation like, if you don't have a substantial second weakness, going to the end game should result in an equal position. So what I think this game is really a good example of is actually how difficult it is for a strong player to defend with just one weakness. I think the level of play has come up overall, so there are lots of examples where people comfortably convert positions like this as a draw for black. But anyway, let's see this one. I had a game quite similar to this one, in fact, several years ago. I was playing an isolated queen pawn situation, and I made some exchanges to convert it to a different kind of weak pawn endgame, but there's only one weakness, so I was frustrated that I only had equality, but my opponent blundered quite easily going to the pawn endgame, which is what Rosenthal also did. So we'll see. I'm going to fast forward a bit, because I think the most important moments in the opening were like, okay, how do we maintain control of the outpost? Identifying this favorable exchange. And now I disagree with Soltis' assessment of these moves. I think the best move was bishop h3. Or maybe not here, but one move later. Yeah, here. I really like this move. Anyway, so humoring Soltis on this particular point, an endgame ensued, and White did the textbook thing and traded pieces when it was beneficial to them, aiming for the pawn endgame, which according to the theory at the time is better for White because there's a weakness on e6. Now here we've reached an equal king and pawn endgame. Yeah, chess starter was right. Bishop h3 was better. No, blockading is with any piece on him. That's the case. Each piece has a different kind of function when it blockades, but they all prevent the pawn from advancing, and they're all difficult to drive away with pawns. So here, I think the next few moves are pretty easy, right? Like White's going to improve their king, Black's going to improve their king, White's going to improve their king, because that's what we do in the endgame, right? We try to use our kings, the most powerful piece. At least in the pawn endgame, king's the most powerful piece. But here's where Black went wrong, and this didn't receive any comment from Soltis. King d6 is a mistake. f4. Why do you guys want to play f4? I don't know why you want to play f4. Because if you play f4 in a position like this, I think this looks accurate. Should be a draw. This is a pretty common method of getting rid of your weakness in the pawn endgame. So f4 could become a target. I like to activate my king. So here is a good moment to pause and see what should Black play in order to equalize. This is their last chance, because I think there's only one move here for Black which is reasonable. And incidentally, the other game that I played that I was mentioning, I won it the same way. My opponent failed to find this kind of resource. Yeah, Anand got it. It's e5, and the idea is that after king e4, king e6, If you try to pass time with the pawns, 2 can play that game, and I never am going to create a fatal second weakness. For instance, if you play f3, at this point, now that you can't play king f5, I'll play king d6 and just shuffle. You can play pawn moves. I'm not going to ever break my good structure. Now, I need to rush through this part because I have to go. But after king d6, king e4, white is winning, because they can never get an e5 without allowing king f5, which takes advantage of the weakness that was created when they played h6. But this is a little bit of luck, I would say, on Bogoljubow's part. Like skill also to like reach this position where black is slightly worse and has to find a tricky move. But it's just lucky that he caved under pressure. And the next conversion step is breaking through. So he gains a lot of space with the pawns, and then finally breaks with g4, and then comes over to collect the queenside pawns. And here Rosenthal resigned. Okay, so I have to run, so I'm going to just kind of quickly dash out here. But I do want to reiterate that my merch store is now open, and I hope you guys will enjoy those things, and I hope you liked our lesson today. So I'll see you guys next time. Thank you.